with this material, and we finally did. It was years later, after we got through our training with the simulators in this particular portion of the project, before we found out exactly where and how this process was going to be used. On the simulator, since it was large, I'm going to go with the 29-footer, which it was, it had to be done in sections, and these sections had adjoining L-type separations. Some were pi sections, some were hexagons, some were squares, and the equipment that we built was in individual pods, so to speak. For example, the flight deck, the avionics, that was split up into about 3 different ones, but when they broke it all apart and shipped the unit, and they put it back together, it would all fit just like a jigsaw puzzle. It worked out well, real well. Like I said, all I did was the mechanical part of it. I knew nothing about the instrumentation on it. We were the mechanical design engineers for the avionics, that's for the flight deck. On this particular thing, the portions that I was involved in were the flight deck and the equipment bay being the bottom of the particular disc. Uhouse claimed that these top secret disc projects went quickly into development in the 1950s. He also testified that he had seen operational discs flying in New Mexico. Sure, they're flying discs around. We started back on the simulators back in the 50s. Uhouse admits that he has very little knowledge of the disc's propulsion systems. Whether or not they go into time warp, that I don't understand. I know they go into some other mode of speed that I'm not familiar with. The reason why you see them go so fast, you see it now and then you see it over there, is because they power down and the ship is visible. They actually power down the ship, so now the ship's visible, so when they power back up and reappear over there, that's what you're seeing. Referencing Bob Lazar, Uhouse has several observations. If everyone here has seen Bob Lazar's poster, that's the closest thing you'll see until you see the real one of a flying disc. The reason why Lazar got out there so fast was because of Teller. All Teller had to do was write that letter and sign it. And I'm sure they were investigating him while they put these Gestapo guys on his butt, and that's like it is. I met a fellow and his name was Gene Huff. As a matter of fact, he knew Bob Lazar and he did the appraisals on my house. He had mentioned UFOs and so forth, and of course I didn't say anything. He gave me some information. I bought some books and started reading and so forth, and then of course Bob Lazar had come on TV and I had watched that program and I said, boy, stuff is leaking out fast.
The alien project was a side project that very few people knew about. It was a highly classified side project. The habitat was apart from everything else in S4. They keep their ship there. They can come and go as they please. They're not detained.
Uhouse refers back to the live bodies from the Kingman crash and claims that he had several occasions to work with a living extraterrestrial during the engineering process. When they first introduced us to the Greys, it was sort of a long period of sessions that we went through, but finally they did, but it was only on a limited, like 2 or 3 minutes or whatever. And the other thing, if they speak to you, you're going to hear it in your own voice.
The agreement, as I understood it, was that the aliens would give us some technology, help us with some technology, and they did this in the form of delivering one of their spacecraft with 2 operators, pilots. And before they delivered the spacecraft and the pilots, they laid a requirement on us, which I got this from the man that built it now, a requirement on us to build a proper habitat for their visitors, for them to live in. And so we did this out at Area 51, in the S4 area of Area 51, where Bill Uhouse, who I later made the acquaintance of, and he told me that when the agreement was reached and they got the specifications for the habitat, he was given part of the job. He was an engineer at Area 51, and he was on the team that was given the job of providing the habitat. And he particularly worked on their sanitary facilities. He said the bathroom had 2 nozzles in the wall, one for water and one for an enzyme that the aliens brought from their home planet that was carried, it was held in a tank. It was evidently a living enzyme. It was held in a tank, and it was dispensed through a nozzle which they lathed over their skin, then rubbed it in and stood there for a few minutes until it cleaned their skin, whatever it was, and it might have nourished them too. And then after that interval, it was washed off with the shower nozzle, and everything was collected in the basin. The enzyme was filtered out and put back in the enzyme tank, and the water was flushed away. And so I said, well, what did they eat? He said that was another problem. He said they brought a culture from their home planet of primary order foods like fungi and spores and chlorophyll, and I don't know what was in it, but it was all simple foods that require less digestion. What we eat is complicated. It starts with the simple foods and gets more complex and more complex and more complex until the meat we eat is about 4 or 5 or 6 generations away from the primary source. And there are things that are added and things that are lost in the process. So our food is not very nutritious. Their food was supremely nutritious for them. And it took little to digest it because it's in lower forms already. And so we had to culture that and provide it to them as a diet and a proper eating facility. All these had to be built to make them comfortable. Sleeping, they had special sleeping requirements, and all this was built in to their little habitat facility out there in S4. And they when it was complete, they came in and inspected it and left the ship and 2 men and took 2 American scientists back to their home planet on a trade-off, reciprocal.
They wore a shirt and a pair of pants. Their shoes were a little different. And this guy's name is J-Rod. Imagine that, J-A-R-O-D. That's a translation from whatever they had given the translators at the facility that I worked at. There's a lot of linguists. There's so many people involved in this whole particular project. Describe fully what this alien looked like.
Well, he had a disproportionately large head, disproportionately large oblique eyes, black. Very little nose, just 2 vertical slits for a nares, for a nose. The ears had no shell on the ears, they were just a slight bump and a membrane. The mouth was just a slit, a narrow, no fleshy lips. It was almost a lipless mouth. And the chin was kind of pointed. The neck was slender and weak looking. No hair at all. The skin was a different skin texture. It was more like the skin of a fine-skinned beaded lizard. And it seemed to be very flexible in all directions. There was no muscular activity in the face. The creature couldn't smile, couldn't grimace, couldn't laugh or anything like that. Could open and close his mouth, but he only, his expression was all in his eyes when Bill could see him. Around the table, the lenses are too dark to see anything. So he didn't manifest any expressions, possibly motion of his hands or something of surprise.
Did Bill say what planetary system or solar system?
No, he said that he had a feeling that he came from Reticulum, but the alien couldn't talk because he has no vocal cords. He has no opening in the back of his mouth at all. The mouth cavity only went back about 4.5 inches, and the mouth cavity was filled with many folds of tissue. And they took the alimentation into the mouth cavity, and a stiff, raspy tongue in the back of it moved it around among the tissue, and the nutrient was absorbed directly into the bloodstream through the tissues in the mouth, and the waste would just spit out like that. And the alimentation that was provided to the aliens at Area 51, Bill said, came in 2 forms. One was tablets that we made of their nourishment, was pressed into tablet form, and so they could carry it around in their pockets. And the other form was a paste that was put in a tube, just squeezed in their mouth.
It was confusing for me for many years since I didn't know what the heck I was working on. After a while, it became apparent that what we were doing was a little bit different than what we normally do on this earth with our sciences. It was sciences from somewhere else. This J-Rod fellow, he was a science translator. We had these big groups of people that were taking information, all these characters and symbols and so forth and so on, and he was assisting those people. We didn't see him very often. Maybe I saw this gentleman about once in a year.
So Bill Uhouse spent 20-some years trying to bridge the gap, and he often would find himself working under the instrumentation consoles of theirs or ours, in a